This upcoming weekend will be the finale for Season 1 of Mushoku Tensei, and Episode 23 will be probably something to remember. Either we get a Season 2 announcement the day it airs, or we might have to wait a while for a Season 2 announcement when it is ready. However, whatever may happen, it will be an episode that's probably going to blow us all away. And speaking of Episode 23, apparently we got no preview images of the upcoming episode, which is rather strange. Usually early Wednesday morning, we get preview images, and as we know a few weeks ago, we even got a special preview video of Episode 21, aka the Orsted vs. Dead End episode. So clearly they're keeping the last episode hush-hush for some reason or another. I doubt it's anything bad for the reason why there is no preview images, because I don't believe the series has any production issues. I could be wrong about that obviously, but I believe its production cycle is healthy. However, we did get something Mushoku Tensei related today. It was the author of the series having an interview with Animenewsnetwork, so I'll have this interview linked in the description if you want to read it yourself. But I want to go over it and discuss things that opened my eyes to the storytelling, so let's begin. The interviewer starts off with, "You first started writing the web version of Mushoku Tensei in 2012, and almost 10 years later, your work has become an anime. Has working on the anime changed your impression of your original work?" The author replies with, "My impression towards the original work hasn't changed, because the anime and novel are different things. What do you think? No matter how powerful and polished the anime is, it doesn't make the original work any better. On the flip side, if the anime were so bad, it makes you want to avert your eyes. It wouldn't make the original work any worse," end quote. So this is rather fascinating stance to take on the anime. The author says no matter how great the anime is, it does not change his previous work at all. Basically, you can assume if the anime elevates the work to an entirely new level and it reaches a whole new realm of popularity, it's not really going to change the original novel at all. I feel this is a fair response because the opposite of this is actually true. If the anime was bad, for example, then the original work's essence would remain the same regardless. Pretty good opening question to start off with, if I do say so myself. So anyways, moving on to the next question. Mushoku Tensei is sometimes called the pioneer of Naruke light novels. How do you feel about this label? FYI, the term Naruke apparently means online novel publishing site. Anyways, moving on to the author's response. It's an honor, but I also feel it's mistaken. When I first started writing on Shosetsuka ni Naru, my work was already deeply influenced by the stories on there. So from my perspective, there are plenty of pioneers above me. End quote. So to explain why Mushoku Tensei has the term pioneer applied to it is because many in the community, even myself a while back, believe Mushoku Tensei is the grandfather of Isekai, but in reality, according to the author himself, it isn't. He goes on to state he was influenced by other stories and other stories that was actually already on the platform, and the only reason it potentially is called the pioneer was because it became popular in the community. It's nice to finally get this question answered by the author himself, and good job on the interviewer for actually asking this question that has been circulating in the community for a very long time now. But anyways, let's continue. Some of the most controversial aspects of Mushoku Tensei are at the very start because it begins with Rudeus at his lowest. Looking back, are there ever times when you think maybe that was a little over the top, or maybe I should have held back a little, or do you think the balance was right for the story you wanted to tell? I believe the interviewer was asking about Rudy's behavior and how he treated the female cast of characters. This is a genuinely good question because a lot of people that dropped Mushoku Tensei potentially dropped it because of the beginning of the story. The author responds with, "I think the balance was right. Because he's a controversial character, his mountain of regrets makes the very act of redoing life more meaningful. Of course, I have no issue with criticizing Rudeus at the beginning stage, and it's up to you to decide whether you don't want to see the story because of that. With that said, if there's someone like Rudeus close to you, and that person were to have even a slight change of heart and try to start over, I sincerely hope that you won't abandon them on the spot." End quote. This answer is honestly thought-provoking and explains a lot of themes throughout the story of Mushoku Tensei. Rudy was an awful human being at the beginning of the story, but over time, if you are up to date, with Mushoku Tensei, the anime at the very least, he has changed a lot. This can be applied to almost all of our characters at that. Basically, it's about how someone so awful can be a better person and have a change of heart. Sometimes people just give up on individuals that are rotten, but maybe there is a way for that rotten individual to change. It's like how Paul was at the beginning of the story and where he is currently at now with his daughter Norn. So it's a really interesting insight to how the author writes his characters. Let's go to the next question. A relatively large part of Mushoku Tensei is about the sexual lives of the characters, including the side characters. Deviant sexual behavior is often depicted as well as a natural part of the world. What inspired you to take this kind of focus in your storytelling? The author's response: in Japanese creative works, there are two polar opposite approaches to depicting sexual life, as sacred or as pleasure. I suppose I got my inspiration because I thought there wasn't enough representation of the viewpoint that reproduction activity is a natural instinct to organisms. I think that among the instincts of a living creature, the urge to breed is the strongest even when put alongside the urge to eat. Most living creatures will genuinely live their lives driven by the natural desire to leave offspring behind. That inevitably goes hand in hand with sexual activity. Basically, it's a natural and important aspect of a living creature. Because it's an important part of the life of an organism, it's not wrong to call it sacred. However, it's also true that sex is associated with pleasure. You could also say that it's natural for people to treat sex as pleasure for as long as pleasure is intertwined with the act. With that in mind, when depicting the world of Mushoku Tensei, I aim for the middle ground between sacred and pleasure. That's the vibe I was going for. Incidentally, when writing the opening act of the story, I strongly emphasized Rudius's perspective on sex as a thing of pleasure. It's only natural because he had no experience in his previous life, so the pleasure aspect was the only side he came into contact with. Consequently, there might be a lot of people who strongly feel the pleasurable side, but that shouldn't be a surprise. You don't broadcast something sacred for all eyes to see. End quote. Now this is a lot to take in from a storytelling perspective and from the general philosophy of Mushoku Tensei. I believe this adds more meaning into Rudy's deviancy in the beginning of the story. He never looked at sexual acts as sacred, only for pleasure and for good reason since he never experienced anything in his previous life besides pleasure. On top of that, it explains his interactions with Eris more in the latest episode. He was trying to be sacred when he held on to the promise he had, so the entire scene is a mixture of what the author was trying to write in the first place. It's interesting to see how he wants people to understand the act of sexual activity is natural in living beings. I actually agree with this statement, and this is good insight into the author's mind while he wrote the story. But let's go on to the next question. Although the story is told through Rudius's point of view, Mushoku Tensei also feels like a story where there are other characters who could have been the main character. If you could tell the story through any other character's point of view, who would you choose? Norn, I suppose. I think that every character has their own story to tell, but I think she would be interesting as a character who treats trivial things as a matter of great importance. End quote. As an anime only, I agree that a lot of our characters can feel like main characters. Eris or even Roxy is a good example of this. Their story is heavily intertwined into the main themes. However, I never considered Norn as an option. It would be interesting to see a what if on Norn's POV for Mushoku Tensei, if it is written or not. But let's move on to the next question. How much do you think you changed as an author over time? Are there any significant differences between Mushoku Tensei and some of your more recent works? The response: I don't think I've changed much, but more often these days when I get praised, I get a compulsive desire to make sure that what I write is proper, so my writing speed has slowed down. So he wants to live up to the expectations of his readers. I like that, and it shows how much he loves his work. I really do like this author, and I'm liking him more as I continue to read this interview. Next question. You often talk about the influence that fighting games had on you on your outlook, but this is not a fact that's well known in the English-speaking world. Could you explain your relationship with fighting games and if that's impacted your writing at all? And the author's response was, I started playing fighting games when I was around 18. Back then, I wasn't really good at dealing with people. In a fighting game, you could compete against other people, so by taking up fighting games in an arcade, I started interacting with people without even knowing their real names. Most of them were older than me, and it was thanks to them that I learned communication and proper manners. But it wasn't as if they gave me verbal tips like do this or do that. I tried to imitate the behavior of the people that I thought were good, and avoided being like the people I thought were bad or often stirred up trouble. Basically, all the common sense things that every human picks up on from somewhere finally came to me in an arcade when I was around 20 years old. Basically, fighting games were what taught me how to clear the minimum bar. As for how they influenced my writing, besides what I've expressed above, there's one other thing. I applied myself to fighting games in my own way, but once I reached a certain stage, I started thinking I've reached my ceiling. To put it another way, I thought I'm done. As far as competitive standards in Japan went, I was firmly in the middle of the pack. But in my local area, I was the strongest, but I also knew that it wasn't really true that it was impossible for me to get any stronger. For example, I could have left my hometown and challenged people who were stronger than me, despite knowing that I didn't want to experience the frustration and setbacks, so I ran away from it, even though the truth was that I really did want to get stronger. That feeling of regret was what supported me when I was writing Mushoku Tensei. When I was having a particular difficult time writing, I would think, if I flake out here, I'll be the same as back then. It was what allowed me to still myself. As a result, I was able to write the web version of Mushoku Tensei all the way to the end. If I didn't have that experience with fighting games, I would have been satisfied at a much earlier stage, and when things became tough, I would have ran away from writing. Needless to say, I don't think I would have reached number 1 in the rankings, and it wouldn't have gotten an anime either. End quote. First things first, I had no idea the author was a huge fighting game fan or even influenced to such a degree from fighting games. This is news to me and I believe to many that read this interview or is currently watching this video. It's inspiring that he learned his communication skills from interacting with people at the arcade. That's actually kinda cool. He also is incredibly humble, saying he was middle tier in terms of skill in fighting games despite him obviously being very skilled. However, the big takeaway is the regret of not continuing down his path of fighting games. He used that emotion to write Mushoku Tensei, which explains a lot of themes on certain characters in the story. Rudy is a good example of this theme of regret. Honestly, this is a great interview, and I'm glad I sat down and read it. Hopefully for those that are currently watching this video, you learned a lot from it, but I'm gonna leave it at that for now. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave me a like, and if you want more of my content to appear in your YouTube feed, then please think about subscribing to the channel. I love you all, and be safe. Chibi out.